On the deck of a battleship, war does not begin with speeches or maps. It begins with vibration. A deep tremor that rises from the hull, travels through the feet, reaches the chest and makes the entire body understand, before the mind, that something enormous is about to happen. On the afternoon of May 31, 1916, thousands of British and German sailors felt exactly that in the North Sea, off the coast of Jutland. Many did not know precisely where they were. Few understood the full strategic picture. Almost no one realized they were about to take part in the largest naval battle of the First World War, a confrontation so vast that it would be remembered not only for its outcome, but for its confusion, its fear, and the raw human experience lived aboard steel ships. This is the story of the Battle of Jutland, told through the eyes of the sailors. Men who saw the war through narrow portholes, clouds of smoke, and shouted orders drowned by the roar of guns. Men who did not see entire fleets but only the next ship, the next impact, the next fire. For them, Jutland was not a grand strategic diagram, it was suffocating heat, tearing metal, bodies thrown against bulkheads, and the constant fear that the next shell would pierce the hull and reach the magazines. At that moment, two colossal forces were moving toward each other. On one side, the British Grand Fleet, pride of the Empire, built to ensure that Britain would never be strangled at sea. On the other, the German High Seas Fleet, modern, disciplined, and fully aware that it could not win a long war, but might shatter the enemy with a single calculated blow. For admirals, Jutland was a problem of numbers, positioning, and timing. For sailors, it was something far simpler, and far more terrifying. It was hours of waiting in stifling compartments without seeing the sky. It was hauling shells heavier than a man. It was rumors racing through steel corridors, the whole fleet is coming, a ship just blew up, the Germans are surrounding us. It was not knowing whether your own ship would still exist 10 minutes from now. When the first shots rang out, they did not sound like they do in history books. They were not clean or orderly. They were deafening. A single salvo made the entire body shudder. Many sailors later said that at the first real impact, fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as an inner silence, an absolute focus on surviving the next second. The Battle of Jutland would not be decided in minutes. It dragged on through chaotic hours, broken into confused phases, misunderstood maneuvers and decisions made under poor visibility. Ships vanished in sudden explosions. Others fought for hours while burning, flooding, and barely holding together. And at the center of it all were ordinary sailors, men who did not choose the strategy but would pay its full price. Throughout this account, we will follow Jutland not as a map, but as a human experience. We will understand what sailors saw, heard, and felt, from the first contacts to the silent return to port, when many realized they had survived the greatest naval battle of their time. Because for those down below, surrounded by steam, steel, and fire, Jutland was not a strategic draw or a debated victory. It was a night that lasted too long, a day that seemed endless, and a memory many carried for the rest of their lives. And it all begins before the first shot is fired, when waiting, perhaps the cruelest part of war, takes hold of the decks. Before the first salvo was fired, the battle had already begun, inside the men. Aboard both British and German ships, the waiting was almost unbearable. There was no visible combat yet, but everything pointed to its approach. Orders were brief. Conversations were whispered. In sealed compartments below the waterline, sailors remained at their stations for hours, surrounded by steel, steam, and the constant smell of oil and old cordite. Many did not know exactly where they were. They only knew that the entire fleet had put to sea, and that happened for one reason only. On the British battleships, engine room crews felt the heat rise as the boilers were pushed to their limits. The noise was continuous, a metallic roar that made it impossible to hear anything except shouted orders from a few inches away. For these sailors, the battle would have no horizon, no visible enemy. They would fight time, pressure, and the constant possibility that a shell might punch through the hull and turn the compartment into a tomb. On the German ships, the feeling was different but no less tense. The High Seas Fleet sailed with a clear awareness of its numerical disadvantage. Sailors knew they could not face the British fleet in a prolonged, equal fight. The mission, as it was explained to them, was to provoke, draw out, wear down, and survive. That created a peculiar tension: fight aggressively, yet always be ready to withdraw on superior orders. For many, this contradiction was hard to process. A sailor's instinct is to press forward once combat begins. But Jutland would demand something else: absolute discipline, even when everything around them suggested chaos. On the upper decks, lookouts strained their eyes against the persistent haze of the North Sea. Visibility shifted constantly. At times, it was possible to see for miles. At others, entire ships vanished behind curtains of smoke and mist. This visual uncertainty became one of the defining features of the battle, and one of the greatest sources of fear for those aboard. Communication depended on flag signals, searchlights, and radio, often distorted or interrupted. Orders arrived late. Some arrived incomplete. Others were misunderstood. For the ordinary sailor, this translated into something very simple. No one was truly sure what was happening as a whole. When the first contacts were finally reported, enemy cruisers sighted, the change in atmosphere was immediate. What had been waiting turned into frantic preparation. Watertight doors were sealed. Equipment was checked one last time. Many men tucked small personal items into their pockets, not out of superstition but habit. Letters, photographs, medals. Light things easy to carry in case abandoning ship became necessary. Then came the first shots. For those below decks, they did not sound like distant explosions. They felt like direct blows to the body. The firing of a main gun made the entire ship shudder, throwing men against bulkheads, shaking tools loose, making lights swing violently. Some sailors later said that at the first real salvo, the sensation was complete disorientation, as if the world had lost its axis for a few seconds. Above, on the gun decks, the experience was even more brutal. The recoil of the guns, the heat of the charges, the thick smoke that quickly accumulated. Orders shouted, repeated, sometimes contradictory. The battle had no steady rhythm. There were moments of tense silence, followed by intense barrages that seemed endless. And then the losses began. Not as numbers but as visual shocks. A ship hit. A column of fire. A sudden flash followed by an explosion that felt too large to be real. Sailors watched in disbelief as a cruiser, filled with men just like them, simply ceased to exist. In seconds. These sudden explosions left a deep mark on those who witnessed them. Many realized then that Battle of Jutland would not be a slow war of attrition, but a succession of fatal instants. One mistake, one shell in the wrong place and everything would be over. And still the ships kept advancing. Because for the sailor at Jutland, there was no option to stop. The battle imposed itself like the sea itself. Immense, confusing, and indifferent to human fear. In the moments that followed, that confusion would grow even greater, when the battle lines finally converged and Jutland ceased to be a series of isolated contacts and became a full, all-encompassing confrontation. It is at that point, when daylight begins to fade and the fighting intensifies, that the sailor's experience reaches its peak. And that is where we go next. As the afternoon wore on, the battle ceased to be anticipation and became continuous reality. For the sailors, there was no longer a clear beginning or middle, only a succession of moments in which the ship still existed, and the constant possibility that it would cease to exist with the next impact. The first major clashes involved the battlecruisers. Fast and heavily armed, these ships were at the front, and the men aboard them knew it. Many British sailors served on ships that, on paper, were powerful. In practice, however, they carried a deadly weakness, insufficient protection at the most critical points. They did not understand this in technical terms. They would learn it in the worst possible way. When a battlecruiser was hit, the effect was not gradual. There was no time to assess damage. In some cases, a single impact was followed by an explosion so violent that the ship simply vanished. To those watching from other decks, it was almost impossible to accept what their eyes were seeing. 1 second a ship advanced in formation. The next there was only fire, smoke and debris falling from the sky. Inside those ships, survivor accounts describe absolute chaos. Heat surged instantly. The air became unbreathable. Lighting failed. Men were hurled against steel bulkheads. Many did not even know whether they had been struck by enemy fire or whether their own guns were firing. Everything merged into total sensory confusion. On the German ships, the experience was just as brutal but different in key ways. Tighter compartmentalization and stricter ammunition handling procedures prevented immediate catastrophic explosions. That did not make combat any less terrifying, it only made it longer. German sailors would later describe the horror of fighting for hours aboard damaged ships, with fires only partially contained and the constant sense that the next hit could be the last. Smoke began to dominate the battlefield. For men on the upper decks, the horizon disappeared. The enemy appeared and vanished as ghostly silhouettes. Sometimes they fired only at flashes of light. At other times they were ordered to engage targets they could not clearly see. The battle felt less like an organized engagement and more like a series of violent, disconnected encounters. Communications failed frequently. Visual signals were swallowed by smoke. Radio messages overlapped. Orders arrived too late, or too early. For the ordinary sailor, this boiled down to one desperate truth: no one seemed to have full control of what was happening. When the main battle lines of the fleets began to form, the scale of the confrontation became almost unimaginable to those aboard. Suddenly it was not just a few ships trading fire. It was dozens of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers all firing, maneuvering, and trying to avoid collisions while engaging an enemy hidden behind curtains of smoke and mist. Hits began to accumulate. Damaged ships slowed. Others closed in to shield them. Wounded sailors were dragged from essential stations and replaced, often by men without specific training. Blood mixed with seawater pouring through ruptures in the hull. There was no time to stop. The ship had to keep fighting. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, a new anxiety spread through the crews: nightfall. For a First World War sailor, night combat was deeply feared. Poor visibility. Difficult identification. A constant risk of collision and surprise attack. Many knew that if the battle continued in darkness, it could become even more chaotic, and even more deadly. And that night was coming. 4 men already exhausted, coated in soot, ears ringing and bodies aching. The idea of fighting without seeing the enemy was almost unbearable. But there was no choice. Battle of Jutland would allow no pauses. In the moments ahead, the fighting would enter its most confused, most fragmented, and for many sailors most terrifying phase of all. The night battle, where fear came not from visible explosions, but from silence suddenly shattered by point-blank gunfire. It is into that darkness that we go next, where Jutland ceased to be merely a great naval battle and became a succession of lethal encounters, lived second by the men who were there. When night fell over the North Sea, the Battle of Jutland entered its most feared phase, the one sailors dreaded most, and for which no one ever felt truly prepared. The light disappeared, but the battle did not. It simply changed shape. For the men aboard the ships, darkness brought no rest. It brought absolute uncertainty. Without radar, without clear visibility, without reliable real-time maps, ships began to move almost blindly. Orders were given with extreme caution. Any silhouette could be an enemy. Any shadow could conceal a torpedo. The sounds of engines, waves striking the hull, and hurried footsteps blended with a tense silence, too heavy to be comforting. On the destroyers, the smaller, faster, more exposed ships, the night was especially brutal. German sailors received orders to launch torpedo attacks against the British fleet. For them, this meant closing in on invisible giants, firing blindly, and vanishing back into the darkness before the main guns could respond. It was a near-suicidal mission. Accounts from these men speak of approaches made with racing hearts, eyes straining to pick out shapes in the dark. When a British battleship suddenly loomed ahead, momentarily illuminated by gun flashes or brief searchlights, the shock was immediate. Torpedoes were launched quickly. Then came violent evasive maneuvers to escape a response that could obliterate the ship in seconds. On the British side, the experience was just as terrifying. Many sailors had never taken part in large-scale night combat. Discipline demanded silence, absolute focus, and nerves of steel. When a torpedo was sighted, sometimes too late, the entire ship seemed to hold its breath as officers shouted maneuvering orders. Some impacts were fatal. Smaller ships vanished into the night with barely any witnesses. Others collided, victims of confusion and poor visibility. Sailors later described the horror of hearing explosions in the darkness without knowing who had been hit, an enemy or an ally. Inside the battleships, the tension was suffocating. Action stations remained manned for endless hours. Exhausted men, many already lightly wounded, stayed on their feet, gripping hot equipment, waiting for the next shock. Fear no longer came from visible explosions but from the unexpected. A sudden impact, a muzzle flash at point-blank range, a torpedo appearing out of nowhere. Night turned Battle of Jutland into something fragmented. There was no longer a single continuous battle, but dozens of small, isolated encounters, each experienced as if it were the only one. For the ordinary sailor, any sense of being part of a vast engagement nearly vanished. What remained was only his own ship, and the need to keep it alive until dawn. At several moments, British and German ships passed dangerously close without realizing it. At others, they opened fire at extremely short range with devastating results. The war became intimate, brutal, and confused, exactly the kind of fighting that would haunt those who survived. When the first light of dawn began to appear, many sailors were at their physical and emotional limits. Some no longer knew how long they had been fighting. Others had completely lost track of what had happened to the rest of the fleet. The dominant feeling was neither victory nor defeat, it was relief at still being alive. And then, almost as abruptly as it had begun, the fighting stopped. With daylight, it became clear that the two fleets had separated during the night. The decisive annihilating battle many had imagined simply did not happen. There was no total destruction. No mass lowering of flags. There were damaged ships, dead men, wounded being treated in haste, and a strange heavy silence spreading across the sea. For the sailors, that silence may have been the hardest moment to process. Because now came the most painful part, counting the missing, assessing the damage, realizing which ships were no longer there. Jutland did not end with a clear gesture of victory. It ended with questions. In the moments ahead, we follow the aftermath through the eyes of those same men. When adrenaline faded, exhaustion took over, and the reality of what they had lived through finally began to settle in. It is there that Jutland ceases to be only combat, and becomes memory. When daylight fully returned over the North Sea, the feeling aboard the ships was not triumph. It was absolute exhaustion. The fighting had stopped, but no one was celebrating. What could be seen now were damaged decks, twisted turrets, broken masts, and men moving slowly, as if their bodies were still trapped in the night before. For the sailors, dawn brought something worse than immediate fear: awareness. Awareness of who was no longer there. Awareness of the smell of burning embedded in their clothes. Awareness of the silence in quarters where voices had once filled the air. On the British ships, damage control teams worked without pause. Flooded compartments were sealed off. Fires were finally extinguished. Wounded men were carried out of improvised aid stations where they had spent the entire night receiving first aid under weak lantern light. Many sailors only realized they were injured once the adrenaline faded and pain asserted itself. On some battleships, decks were still stained with dried blood. Metal fragments, shards of enemy shells, were collected almost mechanically. Not as trophies but as part of post-battle routine. For those who were there was nothing historical about it. It was simply cleanup after survival. On the German ships the scene was much the same. Although many had managed to withdraw in a more organized formation, the damage was unmistakable. Hulls pierced, turrets disabled, the dead removed from battle stations where they had remained throughout the night. Sailors would later speak of the psychological weight of walking the ship at dawn and realizing how many familiar faces were simply gone. And then the counting began. Not an abstract count made by admirals in reports, but an intimate, painful one carried out by ordinary men. He didn't come back. That station is empty. That bunk is still untouched. For many sailors, it was at this moment, and not during the fighting, that the battle truly hit them. Some ships never reappeared on the horizon. Others emerged slowly, severely damaged, nearly unrecognizable. Each reunion brought a brief sense of relief. Each absence added a new weight. What felt strangest to many was realizing that, despite everything they had endured, the war had not been decided there. The German fleet withdrew. The British fleet retained control of the sea. But there was no overwhelming victory that many had expected, nor the clear defeat others had feared. For the sailors, this created a deeply unsettling feeling. If we survived all this, what was it for? The strategic answers would come later, in speeches, books, and analyses. But in that moment, the only truth was human. Thousands of men had taken part in the greatest naval battle ever fought, and the world seemed to carry on almost unchanged the next day. When they returned to port, the contrast was nearly surreal. Cities functioning normally. People walking the streets as if nothing had happened. To many sailors it felt wrong. As if the world on land had not noticed what had taken place at sea. As if the violence of that night had been invisible to everyone else. Later accounts show that many men found it difficult to talk about Jutland soon after returning. Not because of official censorship, but because they could not yet organize the experience in their minds. How do you explain to someone who has never felt a ship shudder under a direct hit? How do you translate the fear of an unseen explosion in the dark? Jutland thus came to exist on two levels. On the strategic level, it became debate. A British victory? A draw? A missed opportunity? On the human level, it became a permanent mark. For the sailors who were there, the official conclusion mattered little. They knew what they had lived through. They knew who they had lost. They knew that for hours they had walked the exact boundary between living and disappearing without a trace. And as time passed, the battle stopped being something that had happened, and became something that lived inside them. In silences, in nightmares, in memories that returned without warning. In the moments ahead, we will see how these sailors carried Jutland throughout their lives. How the greatest naval battle of the First World War did not end in the North Sea, but continued to exist within those who survived. Because for those who were there, Jutland never truly ended at dawn. For many sailors, Jutland did not end when the ships finally anchored again. It continued, silently, persistently, long after the sea was left behind. In the days and weeks that followed, routine tried to reassert itself. Reports were written. Equipment was replaced. Ships were hurriedly repaired and sent back into service. But for the men who had stood on the decks or in the sealed compartments during that endless night, nothing truly felt normal. The battle had left something behind that could not be fixed with fresh steel or new paint. Some sailors reported difficulty sleeping. Others struggled to endure silence. Many avoided speaking about the battle altogether, not because of official orders but because words felt inadequate. How do you explain the sensation of a nearby ship exploding, lighting the night like a brief sun? How do you describe the moment you realize friends have vanished without a trace? Many of these men continued to serve. The war was far from over. The British naval blockade continued to tighten around Germany. The German high seas fleet remained confined, cautious after Jutland. On paper, the strategic balance favored Britain. On deck, however, the feeling was different, that the price paid had been far too high for a result that felt abstract. Among British sailors, a quiet frustration emerged. Many had believed Jutland would be the great day, the decisive confrontation that would end the German threat at sea. Instead, they returned with heavy losses and the sense that everything would continue much as before. For some, that was harder to accept than the battle itself. On the German side, the feeling was equally mixed. There was relief at having faced the largest fleet in the world and returned largely intact. But there was also the realization that the battle had not changed the strategic course of the war. The high seas fleet remained constrained. The British blockade endured. Many German sailors understood then that, despite the courage shown, the sea would not be the path to final victory. As months and years passed, Jutland lived on differently within each survivor. For some, it became a distant episode, hard but contained. For others, it remained a constant weight, a silent reference that reshaped how they viewed risk, authority, and even life itself. Veterans' gatherings, when they occurred, rarely began with talk of the battle. Conversations turned to the weather, family, work. But it took only a single mention of that night in the North Sea for the mood to change. No details were needed. A look, a pause, a slight nod was enough. Everyone knew exactly what it meant. Jutland also shaped how these men understood war itself. Many lost any illusion of naval glory. They came to understand viscerally that battles are experienced in fragments, confused, chaotic, and deeply human, far removed from the clean lines of maps and textbooks. When the First World War finally ended, Jutland had already taken its permanent place in the sailors' memories. Not as a clear victory or a bitter defeat, but as a limit, the greatest level of naval violence they had ever witnessed. Something they never wished to relive. And as decades passed, as those men aged and were gradually lost to time, the battle began to transform into history written by others. But for those who were there, it was never just a chapter in a book. It was a smell, a sound, a night that seemed never to end. In the moments ahead, we will look at how this human experience, lived by thousands of ordinary sailors, came to shape how the world remembers the Battle of Jutland. Not only as a strategic event, but as an extreme test of what war at sea demands from those on board. It is at this point, between personal memory and official history, that we now move forward. As time passed, the Battle of Jutland began to drift away from the living memory of the sailors and move into the realm of official history. And it was precisely there that a deep divide emerged between what had been lived and what came to be told. In reports, Jutland became numbers. Tonnage sunk. Ships lost. Rounds fired. Maneuver diagrams. Endless debates about who won, who lost, who could have done more. For admirals and historians, the battle turned into a problem of strategic interpretation. For the sailors, this always felt strange. Because nothing they had lived through seemed to fit into charts or clean conclusions. How do you translate into statistics the moment when a friendly ship explodes beside you? How do you measure, in terms of victory or defeat, the feeling of spending an entire night waiting for an invisible torpedo to rise out of the darkness? Among veterans, the word outcome was rarely used. They spoke of survival. As the years went by, many of these men realized that the story of Jutland was being shaped by people who had never been there. Some accepted this with resignation. Others felt a quiet frustration at seeing the battle reduced to a matter of national prestige or wounded pride. For a sailor who had carried ammunition under fire, it mattered little whether the fleet had withdrawn in good order or not. What mattered was having come out alive from a place where that had seemed unlikely. Over time, memorials were erected. In Britain, in Germany, in Denmark. Names carved in stone. Dates. List of ships. These memorials offered something the sailors valued deeply: silence. There was no debate there. No winners or losers. Only remembrance. At commemorative ceremonies, survivors stood side by side, former enemies separated by flags decades earlier. Many accounts suggest that, in those moments, there was no resentment. There was mutual recognition. An unspoken understanding that everyone there had faced the same thing, only under different colors. Jutland, seen through the sailors' eyes, was never a story of absolute superiority. It was a story of limits. The limits of the human body under prolonged stress. The limits of technology in the face of chance. The limits of leadership when war becomes too vast to control in real time. Perhaps that is why the battle is still studied today. Not only for what it decided strategically but for what it revealed. It revealed that war at sea, when it reaches that scale, ceases to be something anyone truly controls. It fragments. It slips away. And at the center of that loss of control are always the same people. Ordinary sailors. Men who did not choose the fleet's course. Who did not decide the moment of confrontation. Who did not design the ships on drafting tables. But who were there when everything happened. Jutland was not the end of naval warfare. But it was the end of many illusions. After it, no navy would look at large surface battles in quite the same way again. The lessons learned, many paid for in human lives, would shape future doctrines, ship designs, and quietly the way sailors themselves would be prepared for combat. And yet, for those who lived through that night in the North Sea, none of this erases the direct experience. The battle remains an internal place, inaccessible to maps and books. A place made of sensory memories, old fears, and delayed relief. There is still one final stretch in this journey. Not about strategy. Not about politics. But about what Jutland became with time. When the last witness fell silent, and only collective memory remained. When the last witnesses of Jutland began to disappear, something changed forever. The battle ceased to be remembered through voices that trembled as they described what they had seen and became instead an inherited memory, passed on through books, grainy photographs, and accounts preserved with great effort. For the sailors who survived, this moment carried a quiet weight. Many understood that when they were gone, no one would be able to say, "I was there." The responsibility for explaining Jutland, not as a diagram but as a human experience, would pass to others. And that never felt sufficient. The battle gradually crystallized into interpretations. A strategic draw. A German tactical victory. British naval supremacy maintained. Each of these statements is correct from a certain angle, and profoundly incomplete from another. Because none of them describes what it was like to spend hours waiting for an impact that could tear the ship in half. None explains the sound of a battleship firing just meters away. None translates the moment when dawn arrives and you realize you survived, while others did not. Over time, Jutland came to symbolize something larger than itself. It became the ultimate limit of classical naval warfare. Never again would so much armor, so many guns, and so many men face one another so directly on the open sea, relying primarily on steel, gunpowder, and human sight. The sailors who were there, without knowing it, lived through the end of an era. After Jutland, war at sea began to change. Aviation gained ground. Submarines became decisive strategic weapons. The idea of massive fleets meeting in a single decisive surface battle came to seem not only unlikely but undesirable. The human cost had been far too high for such an ambiguous result. And that ambiguity is an essential part of Jutland's legacy. For those who seek clear winners, it frustrates. For those who seek human lessons, it is inexhaustible. The sailors who lived through the battle rarely spoke of glory. They spoke of limits. The limits of exhaustion. The limits of fear. The limits of physical and mental endurance. Jutland taught them, and indirectly taught the world, that there is a point at which war ceases to be controlled and becomes something that must simply be endured. Today, when the North Sea is calm, nothing suggests that there, for a few hours in 1916, naval warfare reached its peak of violence. The waters conceal wrecks, stories, and silences. And perhaps that is fitting. Because Jutland does not demand remembrance through noise. It asks for respect. There is still one final step to close this account. Not with a strategic conclusion. Not with a definitive answer. But with what the sailors understood better than any admiral. The meaning of having been there. In the end, the Battle of Jutland does not belong to maps, statistics, or endless debates about victory or defeat. It belongs to the sailors. It belongs to the men who spent hours in stifling compartments, not knowing whether the next impact would be the last. To those who watched friendly ships vanish in sudden explosions. To those who endured the night, waiting for an invisible torpedo to emerge from the darkness. To those who greeted the dawn exhausted, covered in soot, trying to understand why they were still alive while so many others were not. For them, Jutland was never a strategic draw. It was a human limit. The limit of bearable fear. The limit of physical endurance. The limit of trust in machines, orders, and symbols. They learned there that war at sea, when it reaches that scale, ceases to be something grand and becomes something intimate. A fight lived second by second in narrow spaces, where decisions made far away echo inside ordinary bodies. When the war ended, many of those sailors returned home and tried to move on. Some succeeded. Others carried Jutland with them for the rest of their lives, not as pride but as a silent memory. A distant sound. A specific smell. A night that never fully faded. As the decades passed, the ships rusted, names were carved into stone, and witnesses fell silent. The North Sea returned to looking like just a sea. But what happened there did not disappear. It remained as a marker of what war demands from those aboard, far from speeches, far from flags, far from final decisions. Jutland was the largest naval battle of the First World War. But above all, it was the battle that showed there are no clear winners for those who live combat from the inside. And perhaps that is the most honest way to remember it. Not as a triumph, not as a failure, but as the extreme experience of thousands of ordinary sailors, pushed to their limits by a war larger than any of them. As long as this story is told this way, with respect, restraint, and truth, Jutland will continue to exist not as the roar of guns, but as human memory. And in that final silence, it finally rests.